什么事儿也干不了，我在这儿闭着眼呢，就是听了一下国务卿布林肯的这个讲话，和我预期的几乎一模一样。他想讲的这个例子我都想到了，这个是昨天的这个讲话，在乔治城大学对同学们讲的，通俗易懂。就讲到了中国现在对美国构成的挑战，对自由民主阵营的一个摧毁作用。那么美国呢，现在民主党这个政府呢，正在号召全世界的爱好普世价值的国家吧，加入美国的这个队伍，消灭中国。消灭呢是我说的啊，我们这些反共人士喜欢把话也说透，政治家政客他不能这么说，这么说得罪人。那小粉红要是想不开自杀了怎么办呢？对吧？所以这个话呢比较含蓄。所以布林肯他讲了3个关键词，一个是投资啊，这个说给美国人民听的啊，一个呢是结盟，就是广交朋友啊，在全世界范围内啊，把所有的有可能跟中共有矛盾的啊、有利益冲突的，全拉到美国阵营来，组成一个反中国阵营、反中国共产党政权的阵营，形成一个新的盟友关系。前2天这个拜登亲自飞到东京去开会啊，叫跨的会议啊，4巨头会议啊，4个重要国家的会议，刚回来。布林肯马上就重新阐述，拜登总统那个意思，展开，能够说到通俗易懂，让一般的大学生、一般同学都能听懂啊。第2个结盟，第3个结盟之后干嘛？有了钱，投了钱，结盟之后干嘛呀？打仗呗，消灭中共吧？不能那么说，不能那么说，太刺激啊！就是竞争啊，他说竞争，这大体上就是这个中心思想就是这个意思吧。这当然中共啊，你想汪文斌啊、赵立坚啊、华春莹啊，他不又忙了吗？又得说嘛。我看了之后挺有意思啊。汪文斌马上举个例子说，这个布林肯一派胡言，全是假信息、假新闻、假情报啊，不靠谱啊，就是诋毁布林肯这个讲话。咱们可以听一听啊，我这个好玩啊，纯粹是好玩。听听外交部发言人这个说法啊。
Antony Blinken, you mentioned at the top of your remarks that Blinken was spreading disinformation. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about that in terms of specific examples.
你让我举一个例子呀，布林肯国务卿讲的什么是虚假信息？我可以给你举一个典型的例子。布林肯国务卿说，中国对国际秩序构成最严重的长期性的挑战，这就是一个典型的虚假信息。
汪维斌在这儿举这个假信息的例子，我呢也借这个机会给汪文斌给他的底裤给他扒下来，来听，
是一个抹黑中方的一个言论。国际规则和国际秩序，大家知道，都是有着明确的内涵的。中方始终主张，各国都要坚定维护以联合国为核心的国际体系，坚定维护以国际法为基础的国际秩序。
各国应该什么什么时候？问题是中国有没有这么做呢？中国恰好是违背这个秩序。我就用汪文斌这个例子，最典型的例子就是把香港给灭掉啊。1984年中共签署的中英联合声明，中共就单方面宣布那是一个历史文件，这就是破坏国际法呀！这打乱国际文明的秩序啊！这就像习近平擅自宣布40年前他和彭丽媛的那个结婚证，习近平单方面宣布那个结婚证是一个历史文件，不算数，对习近平没有约束力。你说彭丽媛能同意吗？
坚定维护以联合国宪章宗旨和原则为基础的国际关系基本准则。中方始终是国际秩序的坚定维护者。说中方对国际秩序 构成最严重长期性的挑战，这不是虚假信息，又是什么呢？
Just on the
汪文斌这是狡辩，这是这个他不是跟你讲道理，他是狡辩。中国就是在全方位的各个方面都在挑战这个国际秩序，而且真正刺激拜登的，大家知道是个具体例子吗？我待会儿讲吧。真正刺激拜登现在就是现在拜登现在这个打击中共的力度已经超过川普了。注意啊，这个是很严肃的啊。我们这儿听听布林肯这个讲话。
And I especially want to thank our friends at the Asia Society, dedicated to forging closer ties with the countries and people of Asia to try to enhance peace, prosperity, freedom, equality, sustainability. Thank you for hosting us today, but thank you for your leadership every day. Kevin Rudd, Wendy Cutler, Danny Russell, all colleagues, all thought leaders, but also doers. And it's always wonderful to be with you. And I have to say, I am really grateful, Senator Romney, for your presence here today. A man, a leader that I greatly admire, a person of tremendous principle who has been leading on the subject that we're going to talk about today. Senator, thank you for your presence. And I'm also delighted to see so many members of the diplomatic corps, because diplomacy is the indispensable tool for shaping our shared future. In the past 2 years, we've come together to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and prepare for future global health emergencies, rebuild from economic shocks, from supply chain disruptions to debt crises, and take on climate change and reimagine an energy future that's cleaner, more secure, and more affordable. The common denominator across these efforts is the simple fact that none of us can meet these challenges alone. We have to face them together. That's why we put diplomacy back at the center of American foreign policy, to help us realize the future that Americans and people around the world seek, one where technology is used to lift people up, not suppress them, where trade and commerce support workers, raise incomes, create opportunity, where universal human rights are respected, countries are secure from coercion and aggression, and people, ideas, goods, and capital move freely, and where nations can both forge their own paths and
他这个布林肯的讲话，你们听到现在，你就知道他就是一个教授，就像教授在上课一样。没有激情，没有这个，没有那个娱乐性演讲的那个特点，就是一个学术性演讲。他讲的这个话都是对的啊，非常正确。在一个大学里边，一流的大学里边，乔治城有一个外交学院，啊，那是相当的厉害啊。这个他应该是给这研究生量级的人在讲。就讲外交的重要性啊，那就是说现在美国在面临着很多新的挑战，美国自己解决不了，必须得动员全世界的人，争取更多的人站在美国一边来解决这个问题啊，解决这些问题。当然，今天的主题是中国吧，讲中国的威胁啊，所以就是他在展开好多事必须。全世界各国合作
work together effectively in common cause. To build that future, we must defend and reform the rules-based international order, the system of laws, agreements, principles, and institutions that the world came together to build after 2 world wars, to manage relations between states, to prevent conflict, to uphold the rights of all people. Its founding documents include the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which enshrine concepts like self-determination.
注意啊，他讲到的这个 Universal Declaration of Human Rights 就是这个世界人权宣言，这个就是我李荣焕经常讲的普世价值，它是同等的概念啊，就是普世价值。中国大陆有很多人呢，他搞不明白普世价值到底什么，很多人产生怀疑，瞎怀疑啊，普世价值是什么？普世价值是什么？他说不清楚，就是这个世界人权宣言的具体内容有30多条。
Sovereignty, the peaceful settlement of disputes. These are not Western constructs. They are reflections of the world's shared aspirations.
这是全人类的理想。他刚才注意啊，他刚才可是重点讲了一个关键词，就是 self-determination， 那这个是说给台湾人听的，这个话啊，这个内行一听，这是鼓励台湾人搞独立，台湾人和平的独立宣布建国啊，这个是完全符合普世价值啊，而且美国永远不可能反对这个东西。注意啊，台湾的思想界、知识界比较猥琐，他们不敢朝这方面想。
In the decades since, despite daunting challenges and despite the gap between our ideals and some of the results we've achieved, the countries of the world have avoided another world war, an armed conflict between nuclear powers. We built a global economy that lifted billions of people out of poverty. We've advanced human rights as never before. Now, as we look to the future, we want not just to sustain the international order that made so much of that progress possible, but to modernize it, to make sure that it represents the interests, the values, the hopes of all nations, big and small, from every region. And furthermore, that it can meet the challenges that we face now and will face in the future, many of which are beyond what the world could have imagined 7 decades ago. But that outcome is not guaranteed, because the foundations of the international order are under serious and sustained challenge. Russian President Vladimir Putin poses a clear and present threat. In attacking Ukraine 3 months ago, he also attacked the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity enshrined in the UN Charter to protect all countries from being conquered or coerced. That's why so many countries have united to oppose this aggression, because they see it as a direct assault on the foundation of their own peace and security. Ukraine is fighting valiantly to defend its people and its independence, with unprecedented assistance from the United States and countries around the world. And while the war is not over, President Putin has failed to achieve a single one of his strategic aims. Instead of erasing Ukraine's independence, he strengthened it. Instead of dividing NATO, he's united it. Instead of asserting Russia's strength, he's undermined it. And instead of weakening the international order, he has brought countries together to defend it. Even as President Putin's war continues, we will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years. China is also integral to the global economy and to our ability to solve challenges from climate to COVID. Put simply, the United States and China have to deal with each other for the foreseeable future. That's why this is one of the most complex and consequential relationships of any that we have in the world today. Over the last year, the Biden administration has developed and implemented a comprehensive strategy to harness our national strengths and our unmatched network of allies and partners to realize the future that we seek. We are not looking for conflict or a new Cold War. To the contrary, we're determined to avoid both. We don't seek to block China from its role as a major power, nor to stop China, or any other country for that matter, from growing their economy or advancing the interests of their people. But we will defend and strengthen the international law, agreements, principles, and institutions that maintain peace and security, protect the rights of individuals and sovereign nations, and make it possible for all countries, including the United States and China, to coexist and cooperate. Now, the China of today is very different from the China of 50 years ago, when President Nixon broke decades of strained relations to become the first U.S. president to visit the country. Then, China was isolated and struggling with widespread poverty and hunger. Now, China is a global power with extraordinary reach, influence, and ambition. It's the second largest economy, with world-class cities and public transportation networks. It's home to some of the world's largest tech companies, and it seeks to dominate the technologies and industries of the future. It's rapidly modernized its military and intends to become a top-tier fighting force with global reach. And it has announced its ambition to create a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and to become the world's leading power. China's transformation is due to the talent, the ingenuity, the hard work of the Chinese people. It was also made possible by the stability and opportunity that the international order provides. Arguably, no country on earth has benefited more from that than China. But rather than using its power to reinforce and revitalize the laws, the agreements, the principles, the institutions that enabled its success so that other countries can benefit from them too, Beijing is undermining them. Under President Xi, the ruling Chinese Communist Party has become more repressive at home and more aggressive abroad. We see that in how Beijing has perfected mass surveillance within China and exported that technology to more than 80 countries. How it's advancing unlawful maritime claims in the South China Sea, undermining peace and security, freedom of navigation and commerce. How it's circumventing or breaking trade rules, harming workers and companies in the United States, but also around the world. And how it purports to champion sovereignty and territorial integrity while standing with governments that brazenly violate them. Even while Russia was clearly mobilizing to invade Ukraine, President Xi and President Putin declared that the friendship between their countries was, and I quote, without limits. Just this week, as President Biden was visiting Japan, China and Russia conducted a strategic bomber patrol together in the region. Beijing's defense of President Putin's war to erase Ukraine's sovereignty and secure a sphere of influence in Europe should raise alarm bells for all of us who call the Indo-Pacific region home. For these reasons and more, this is a charged moment for the world. And at times like these, diplomacy is vital. It's how we make clear our profound concerns, better understand each other's perspective, and have no doubt about each other's intentions. We stand ready to increase our direct communication with Beijing across a full range of issues. And we hope that that can happen. But we cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So, we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system. President Biden believes this decade will be decisive. The actions that we take at home and with countries worldwide will determine whether our shared vision of the future will be realized. To succeed in this decisive decade, the Biden administration's strategy can be summed up in 3 words: invest, align, compete. We will invest in the foundations of our strength here at home, our competitiveness, our innovation, our democracy. We will align our efforts with our network of allies and partners, acting with common purpose and in common cause. And harnessing these 2 key assets, we'll compete with China to defend our interests and build our vision for the future. We take on this challenge with confidence. Our country is endowed with many strengths. We have peaceful neighbors, a diverse and growing population, abundant resources, the world's reserve currency, the most powerful military on earth, and a thriving culture of innovation and entrepreneurship that, for example, produced multiple effective vaccines, now protecting people worldwide from COVID-19. And our open society, at its best, attracts flows of talent and investment and has time-tested capacity for reinvention, rooted in our democracy, empowering us to meet whatever challenges we face. First, on investing in our strength. After the Second World War, as we and our partners were building the rules-based order, our federal government was also making strategic investments in scientific research, education, infrastructure, our workforce, creating millions of middle-class jobs and decades of prosperity and technology leadership. But we took those foundations for granted. And so it's time to get back to basics. The Biden administration is making far-reaching investments in our core sources of national strength, starting with a modern industrial strategy to sustain and expand our economic and technological influence, make our economy and supply chains more resilient, sharpen our competitive edge. Last year, President Biden signed into law the largest infrastructure investment in our history to modernize our highways, our ports, airports, rail, and bridges, to move goods to market faster, to boost our productivity, to expand high-speed internet to every corner of the country, to draw more businesses and more jobs to more parts of America. We're making strategic investments in education and worker training so that American workers, the best in the world, can design, build, and operate the technologies of the future. Because our industrial strategy centers on technology, we want to invest in research, development, advanced manufacturing. 60 years ago, our government spent more than twice as much on research as a percentage of our economy as we do now. Investments that in turn catalyze private sector innovation. It's how we won the space race, invented the semiconductor, built the internet. We used to rank first in the world in R&D as a proportion of our GDP. Now, we're ninth. Meanwhile, China has risen from 8th place to 2nd. With bipartisan congressional support, we'll reverse these trends and make historic investments in research and innovation, including in fields like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing. These are areas that Beijing is determined to lead. But given America's advantages, the competition is ours to lose, not only in terms of developing new technologies, but also in shaping how they're used around the world so that they're rooted in democratic values, not authoritarian ones. The leadership, Senator Romney and others, the House and Senate have passed bills to support this agenda, including billions to produce semiconductors here and to strengthen other critical supply chains. Now, we need Congress to send the legislation to the President for his signature. We can get this done, and it can't wait. Supply chains are moving now, and if we don't draw them here, they'll be established somewhere else.
讲供应链
As
的问题
President Biden has said, the Chinese Communist Party is lobbying against this legislation because there's no better way to enhance our global standing and influence than to deliver on our domestic renewal. These investments will not only make America stronger, they'll make us a stronger partner and ally as well. One of the most powerful, even magical things about the United States is that we've long been a destination for talented, driven people from every part of the planet. That includes millions of students from China who've enriched our communities and forged lifelong bonds with Americans. Last year, despite the pandemic, we issued more than 100,000 visas to Chinese students in just 4 months, our highest rate ever. We're thrilled that they've chosen to study in the United States. We're lucky to have them. And we're lucky when the best global talent not only studies here, but stays here, as more than 80% of Chinese students who pursue science and technology PhDs in the United States have done in recent years. They help drive innovation here at home, and that benefits all of us. We can stay vigilant about our national security without closing our doors. We also know from our history that when we're managing a challenging relationship with another government, people from that country or with that heritage can be made to feel that they don't belong here or that they're our adversaries. Nothing could be further from the truth. Chinese Americans made invaluable contributions to our country. They've done so for generations.
表扬中国人了。
Mistreating someone of Chinese descent goes against everything we stand for as a country, whether a Chinese national visiting or living here, or a Chinese American, or any other Asian American whose claim to this country is equal to anyone else's. Racism and hate have no place in a nation built by generations of immigrants to fulfill the promise of opportunity for all. We have profound differences with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, but those differences are between governments and systems, not between our people. The American people have great respect for the Chinese people. We respect their achievements, their history, their culture. We deeply value the ties of family and friendship that connect us. And we sincerely wish for our governments to work together on issues that matter to their lives and to the lives of Americans, and for that matter, the lives of people around the world. There's another core source of national strength that we'll be relying on in this decisive decade: our democracy. 100 years ago, if asked what constitutes the wealth of a nation, we might list the expanse of our land, the size of our population, the strength of our military, the abundance of our natural resources. And thankfully, we're still wealthy in all of those attributes. But more than ever in this 21st century, The true wealth of a nation is found in our people, our human resources, and our ability to unleash their full potential. We do that with our democratic system. We debate, we argue, we disagree, we challenge each other, including our elected leaders. We deal with our deficiencies openly. We don't pretend they don't exist or sweep them under the rug. And though progress can feel painfully slow, it can be difficult and ugly, by and large,
讲民主制
we
度的好
consistently
处。
work toward a society where people from all backgrounds can flourish, guided by national values that unite, motivate, and uplift us. We're not perfect, but at our best, we always strive to be, in the words of our Constitution, a more perfect union. Our democracy is designed to make that happen. That's what the American people and the American model offer, and it's one of the most powerful assets in this contest. Now, Beijing believes that its model is the better one, that a party-led, centralized system is more efficient, less messy, ultimately superior to democracy.
安娜说，供应链要离开中
We
国
do
了
not。seek to transform China's
你
political
抓住要
system.
点了，是这样。
Our task is to prove once again that democracy can meet urgent challenges, create opportunity, advance human dignity. That the future belongs to those who believe in freedom. And that all countries will be free to chart their own paths without coercion. The second piece of our strategy is aligning with our allies and partners to advance a shared vision for the future. From day one, the Biden administration has worked to re-energize America's unmatched network of alliances and partnerships and to re-engage in international institutions.
将重
We're
新结
encouraging
盟，
partners to work with each other
重新结盟，
and through regional and global organizations.
交朋友。
And
美国也要
we're
交朋
standing
友
up。new coalitions to deliver for our people and meet the tests of the century ahead. Nowhere is this more true than in the Indo-Pacific region, where our relationships, including our treaty alliances, are among our strongest in the world. The United States shares the vision that countries and people across the region hold, one of a free and open Indo-Pacific where rules are developed transparently and applied fairly, where countries are free to make their own sovereign decisions, where goods, ideas, and people flow freely across land, sky, cyberspace, the open seas, and governance is responsive to the people. President Biden reinforced these priorities this week with his trip to the region, where he reaffirmed our vital security alliances with South Korea and Japan and deepened our economic and technology cooperation with both countries. He launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, a first-of-its-kind initiative for the region. It will, in the President's words, help all our countries' economies grow faster and fairer. IPEF, as we call it, renews American economic leadership, but adapts it for the 21st century by addressing cutting-edge issues like the digital economy, supply chains, clean energy infrastructure, and corruption. A dozen countries, including India, have already joined. Together, IPEF members make up more than a third of the global economy. The President also took part in the Leaders' Summit of the Quad countries, Australia, Japan, India, the United States. The Quad never met at the leader level before President Biden took office. Since he convened the first leaders meeting last year, the Quad has held 4 summits. It's become a leading regional team. This week, it launched a new Indo-Pacific partnership for maritime domain awareness, so our partners across the region can better monitor the waters near their shores to address illegal fishing and protect their maritime rights and their sovereignty. We're reinvigorating our cooperation with ASEAN. Earlier this month, we hosted the U.S. Asean Summit to take on urgent issues like public health and the climate crisis together. This week, 7 ASEAN countries became founding members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And we're building bridges among our Indo-Pacific and European partners, including by inviting Asian allies to the NATO Summit in Madrid next month. We're enhancing peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, for example, with the new security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, known as AUKUS. And we're helping countries in the region and around the world defeat COVID-19. To date, the United States has provided nearly $20 billion to the global pandemic response. That includes more than 540 million doses of safe and effective vaccines donated, not sold, with no political strings attached, on our way to 1.2 billion doses worldwide. And we're coordinating with a group of 19 countries in a global action plan to get shots into arms. As a result of all of this diplomacy, we are more aligned with partners across the Indo-Pacific, and we're working in a more coordinated way toward our shared goals. We've also deepened our alignment across the Atlantic. We launched the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council last year, marshaling the combined weight of nearly 50% of the world's GDP. Last week, I joined Secretary Raimondo, Ambassador Tai, and our European Commission counterparts for our second meeting to work together on new technology standards, coordinate on investment screening and export controls, strengthen supply chains, boost green tech, and improve food security and digital infrastructure in developing countries. Meanwhile, we and our European partners set aside 17 years of litigation about aircraft. Now, instead of arguing with each other, we're working to secure a level playing field for our companies and workers in that sector. Similarly, we worked with the European Union and others to resolve a dispute on steel and aluminum imports. And now we're coming together around a shared vision on higher climate standards and protecting our workers and industries from Beijing's deliberate efforts to distort the market to its advantage. We're partnering with the European Union to protect our citizens' privacy while strengthening a shared digital economy that depends on vast flows of data. With the G20, we reached a landmark deal on a global minimum tax to halt the race to the bottom, make sure that big corporations pay their fair share, and give countries even more resources to invest in their people. More than 130 countries have signed on so far. We and our G7 partners are pursuing a coordinated, high standard and transparent approach to meet the enormous infrastructure needs in developing countries. We've convened global summits on defeating COVID-19 and renewing global democracy, and rejoined the UN Human Rights Council and the WHO, the World Health Organization. And at a moment of great testing, we and our allies have re-energized NATO, which is now as strong as ever. These actions are all aimed at defending and, as necessary, reforming the rules-based order that should benefit all nations. We want to lead a race to the top on tech, on climate, infrastructure, global health, and inclusive economic growth. And we want to strengthen a system in which as many countries as possible can come together to cooperate effectively, resolve differences peacefully, write their own futures as sovereign equals. Our diplomacy is based on partnership and respect for each other's interests. We don't expect every country to have the exact same assessment of China as we do. We know that many countries, including the United States, have vital economic or people-to-people ties with China that they want to preserve. This is not about forcing countries to choose, it's about giving them a choice. So that, for example, the only option isn't an opaque investment that leaves countries in debt, stokes corruption, harms the environment, fails to create local jobs or growth, and compromises countries' exercise of their sovereignty. We've heard firsthand about buyer's remorse that these deals can leave behind. At every step, we're consulting with our partners, listening to them, taking their concerns to heart, building solutions that address their unique challenges and priorities. There is growing convergence about the need to approach relations with Beijing with more realism. Many of our partners already know from painful experience how Beijing can come down hard when they make choices that it dislikes. Like last spring, when Beijing cut off Chinese students and tourists from traveling to Australia and imposed an 80% tariff on Australian barley exports because Australia's government called for an independent inquiry into COVID's origin. Or last November, when Chinese Coast Guard vessels used water cannons to stop a resupply of a Philippine Navy ship in the South China Sea. Actions like these remind the world of how Beijing can retaliate against perceived opposition. There's another area of alignment we share with our allies and partners: human rights. The United States stands with countries and people around the world against the genocide and crimes against humanity happening in the Xinjiang region, where more than 1 million people have been placed in detention camps because of their ethnic and religious identity. We stand together on Tibet, where the authorities continue to wage a brutal campaign against Tibetans and their culture, language, and religious traditions. And in Hong Kong, where the Chinese Communist Party has imposed harsh anti-democratic measures under the guise of national security. Now, Beijing insists that these are somehow internal matters that others have no right to raise. That is wrong. Its treatment of ethnic and religious minorities in Xinjiang and Tibet, along with many other actions, go against the core tenets of the UN Charter that Beijing constantly cites and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that all countries are meant to adhere to. Beijing's quashing of freedom in Hong Kong violates its handover commitments enshrined in a treaty deposited at the United Nations. We'll continue.
他这儿就举了这个例子啊，就是说中国是破坏国际秩序的，包括1984年的中英联合声明，那个文件是存在国际法的档案库里的，是存在联合国的，它是一个重要的文件，它不是一个历史文件。除非中国政府跟英国政府协商，宣布1984年中英联合声明作废，共同同意，共同作废，可以作废，不可能像中国那样，战狼所搞的那样，他一张嘴就把这个习近平和彭丽媛的这个结婚证给否了，单方面不承认他的有效法律效力，这怎么可以啊？有些文件是永远有效的，这共产党就是胡搞，现在根本就是破坏人类的正常的文明秩序。布林肯刚才讲话就是举这个例子，就是我都猜到了，我估计他就举这个例子，果然举这个例子。
To raise these issues and call for change, not to stand against China, but to stand up for peace, security, and human dignity. That brings us to the third element of our strategy. Thanks to increased investments at home and greater alignment with allies and partners, we are well positioned to outcompete China in key areas. For example, Beijing wants to put itself at the center of global innovation and manufacturing, increase other countries' technological dependence, and then use that dependence to impose its foreign policy preferences. And Beijing is going to great lengths to win this contest. For example, taking advantage of the openness of our economies to spy, to hack, to steal technology and know-how, to advance its military innovation, and entrench its surveillance state. So, as we make sure the next wave of innovation is unleashed by the United States and our allies and partners, we'll also protect ourselves against efforts to siphon off our ingenuity or imperil our security. We're sharpening our tools to safeguard our technological competitiveness. That includes new and stronger export controls to make sure our critical innovations don't end up in the wrong hands. Greater protections for academic research to create an open, secure, and supportive environment for science. Better cyber defenses. Stronger security for sensitive data. And sharper investment screening measures to defend companies and countries against Beijing's efforts to gain access to sensitive technologies, data, or critical infrastructure, compromise our supply chains, or dominate key strategic sectors. We believe, and we expect the business community to understand, that the price of admission to China's market must not be the sacrifice of our core values or long-term competitive and technological advantages. We're counting on businesses to pursue growth responsibly, assess risks soberly, and work with us, not only to protect, but to strengthen our national security. For too long, Chinese companies have enjoyed far greater access to our markets than our companies have in China. For example, Americans who want to read the China Daily or communicate via WeChat are free to do so. But the New York Times and Twitter are prohibited for the Chinese people, except those working for the government who use these platforms to spread propaganda and disinformation. American companies operating in China have been subject to systematic forced technology transfer, while Chinese companies in America have been protected by our rule of law. Chinese filmmakers can freely market their movies to American theater owners without any censorship by the U.S. government. But Beijing strictly limits the number of foreign movies allowed in the Chinese market, and those that are allowed are subjected to heavy-handed political censorship. China's business.
这又是讲中国破坏国际规则啊！国际上的惯例都是要对等的。比如讲，美国允许《环球时报》《人民日报》在美国自由的发行，美国也不封锁他们的网站，美国人民可以想看就能看到。反过来就不行，《纽约时报》你在中国能买得到吗？ 网站是不是封了呀？啊，这怎么解释啊？没法解释，就耍流氓吧。这个不对等呢，是蓬佩奥上一任国务卿余茂春给他提醒的。蓬佩奥经常讲，现在美国要求在很多领域实行对等，这已经形成惯例了，两党共识啊。刚刚这布林肯新国务卿在这讲，就讲到，就举这个例子啊，经典例子啊，为什么我们不封你人民日报，你们封我们的纽约时报啊？这怎么解释？你这不是破坏规则是什么？王文斌，你解释一下，解释个啥呀？这公开耍流氓。
Businesses in the United States don't fear using our impartial legal system to defend their rights. In fact, they're frequently in court asserting claims against the United States government. The same isn't true for foreign firms in China. This lack of reciprocity is unacceptable and it's unsustainable. Or consider what happened in the steel market. Beijing directed massive overinvestment by Chinese companies, which then flooded the global market with cheap steel. Unlike U.S. companies and other market-oriented firms, Chinese companies don't need to make a profit. They just get another injection of state-owned bank credit when funds are running low. Plus, they do little to control pollution or protect the rights of their workers, which also keeps costs down. As a consequence, China now accounts for more than half of global steel production, driving U.S. companies as well as factories in India, Mexico, Indonesia, Europe, and elsewhere out of the market. We've seen the same model when it comes to solar panels, electric car batteries, key sectors of the 21st century economy that we cannot allow to become completely dependent on China. Economic manipulations like these have cost American workers millions of jobs, and they've harmed the workers and firms of countries around the world. We will push back on market-distorting policies and practices like subsidies and market access barriers, which China's government has used for years to gain competitive advantage. We'll boost supply chain security and resilience by reshoring production or sourcing materials from other countries in sensitive sectors like pharmaceuticals and critical minerals so that we're not dependent on any one supplier. We'll stand together with others against economic coercion and intimidation. And we will work to ensure that U.S. companies don't engage in commerce that facilitates or benefits from human rights abuses, including forced labor. In short, we'll fight for American workers and industry with every tool we have, just as we know that our partners will fight for their workers. The United States does not want to sever China's economy from ours or from the global economy, though Beijing, despite its rhetoric, is pursuing asymmetric decoupling, seeking to make China less dependent on the world and the world more dependent on China. For our part, we want trade and investment, as long as they're fair and don't jeopardize our national security. China has formidable economic resources, including a highly capable workforce. We're confident that our workers, our companies, will compete successfully, and we welcome that competition on a level playing field. So, as we push back responsibly on unfair technology and economic practices, we'll work to maintain economic and people-to-people ties connecting the United States and China, consistent with our interests and our values. Beijing may not be willing to change its behavior, but if it takes concrete action to address the concerns that we and many other countries have voiced, we will respond positively. Competition need not lead to conflict. We do not seek it. We will work to avoid it. But we will defend our interests against any threat. To that end, President Biden has instructed the Department of Defense to hold China as its pacing challenge to ensure that our military stays ahead. We'll seek to preserve peace through a new approach that we call integrated deterrence, bringing in allies and partners, working across the conventional, the nuclear, space, and informational domains, drawing on our reinforcing strengths in economics, in technology, and in diplomacy. The administration is shifting our military investments away from platforms that were designed for the conflicts of the 20th century toward asymmetric systems that are longer range, harder to find, easier to move. We're developing new concepts to guide how we conduct military operations. And we're diversifying our force posture and global footprint, fortifying our networks, critical civilian infrastructure, and space-based capabilities. We'll help our allies and partners in the region with their own asymmetric capabilities too. We'll continue to oppose Beijing's aggressive and unlawful activities in the South and East China Seas. Nearly 6 years ago, an international tribunal found that Beijing's claims in the South China Sea have no basis in international law. We'll support the region's coastal states in upholding their...
注意啊，他这儿讲到这个南海主权问题啊，他说几年前，6年之前是吧？国际上一个什么法庭判决，南海不属于中国，南海不属于中国啊，这中国可能不敢应对这个东西，已经输了啊。这是美国的这个既定立场啊，什么西沙群岛、南沙群岛，胡说八道，整个南海就不属于中国，那是国际海。
Their maritime rights. We'll work with allies and partners to uphold freedom of navigation and overflight, which has enabled the region's prosperity for decades. And we'll continue to fly and sail wherever international law allows. On Taiwan, our approach has been consistent across decades and administrations. As the President has said, our policy has not changed. The United States remains committed to our one China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the Three Joint Communiqués, the 6 assurances. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. We do not support Taiwan independence, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means. We continue to have an abiding interest in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We'll continue to uphold our commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act to assist Taiwan in maintaining a sufficient self-defense capability and, as indicated in the TRA, to...
注意啊，这个地方讲了一个要点，这个是很重要啊。他这儿布林肯这个讲话啊，就是往前推个10几秒、20秒啊，他明确讲，我们 we oppose Taiwan independence， 就是我们反对台湾独立。他这个上下文是说呢，我们美国是反对台湾和大陆任何一方单方面的改变现状啊，就是单方面打破和平吧。他说这个美国反对台湾独立这个说法实际上是经不住推敲的，按照美国的价值观，按照普世价值观，按照联合国宪章，按照一切美国所推崇的这个思想价值观，美国政府不能够反对台湾人民追求独立，这个是台湾人民的基本权利。但是呢，大概是很早从克林顿时期吧，就开了这个先例，就是美国的总统呢，在公开场合确实说我们反对台湾独立，或者我们不支持台湾独立，或者换一个这个隐晦的时候，我们反对任何一方打破这个现状啊。这个实际上经不住推敲。这个地儿呢，我一开始看到台湾的一些节目在提到这点，我都不相信，我不相信这个布林肯会说出这么没水平的话来。我一听还真是真说了我们反对台湾独立，这个话实际上是不对的这台湾要是花点钱请人写文章驳斥布林肯的这个讲话，涉及到台湾独立这个反对台湾独立是没有根据的。美国没有任何根据可以反对台湾人民追求独立这个才是正道理。这布林肯呢也是接受了他前任民主党的总统克林顿说过这个话，共和党的总统或者共和党的国务卿绝对不可能说这个话。注意这就是区别，这个细节，这是细节。
To maintain our capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize our security or the social or economic system of Taiwan. To our one China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act.
我们一直坚持一个中国的政策这个是美国政客都反复讲，我们坚持一个中国的政策，因为这个是尼克松、基辛格和周恩来、毛泽东他们达成的协议，我们到现在还没有把它宣布为历史协议、历史文件，我们还是要遵守的。当时的承诺，我们现在还算数，我们也得遵守就这个意思。 但是实际上，什么是一个中国？一中各表吧，九二共识，国民党的这个一个文胆叫苏起发明了一个九二共识。实际上，那个九二共识是一个伪概念，因为不存在共识。因为什么是一个中国？没有统一的标准，没有统一的定义。
The Three Joint Communiqués, the 6 assurances. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. We do not support Taiwan independence.
大家听了吗 ？We do not support Taiwan independence。这话是从他嘴里说出来的，因为他是民主党，因为他的前任克林顿说过这话，他的前任总统克林顿开了历史的先河啊，那个克林顿估计是被江泽民给搞定了，所以说是有点过分，那个话是不正确的。现在呢，他现在也说这个话，这话我认为是个败笔。
And we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means. We continue to have an abiding interest in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We'll continue to uphold our commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act to assist Taiwan in maintaining a sufficient self-defense capability and, as indicated in the TRA, to maintain our capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize our security or the social or economic system of Taiwan. We enjoy a strong unofficial relationship with Taiwan, a vibrant democracy and leading economy in the region. We'll continue to expand our cooperation with Taiwan on our many shared interests and values, support Taiwan's meaningful participation in the international community, deepen our economic ties consistent with our One China policy. While our policy has not changed, what has changed is Beijing's growing coercion, like trying to cut off Taiwan's relations with countries around the world and blocking it from participating in international organizations. And Beijing has engaged in increasingly provocative rhetoric and activity.
他现在开始反咬一口，他说我们的一中政策、一个中国政策没有改变啊，改变的是中国共产党，是习近平，他的胃口、他的野心越来越大。这话说的是对的啊，确实是这样。美国没有政策改变，还是老政策啊，但是习近平呢？不断的在喧嚣武统，要求这个威胁打台湾，要打仗，学普京擅自发动战争，这个让美国人很着急。他这个地方是就是实际上是把这个反咬一口吧，我觉得咬得对。
Like flying PLA aircraft near Taiwan on an almost daily basis. These words and actions are deeply destabilizing. They risk miscalculation and threaten the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. As we saw from the President's discussions with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, maintaining peace and stability across the Strait is not just a U.S. interest. It is a matter of international concern, critical to regional and global security and prosperity. As President Biden likes to say, the only conflict worse than an intended one is an unintended one. We'll manage this relationship responsibly to prevent that from happening. We've prioritized crisis communications and risk reduction measures with Beijing. And on this issue and every other, we remain committed to intense diplomacy alongside intense competition. Even as we invest, align, and compete, we'll work together with Beijing where our interests come together. We can't let the disagreements that divide us stop us from moving forward on the priorities that demand that we work together for the good of our people and for the good of the world. That starts with climate. China and the United States had years of stalemate on climate, which gridlocked the world, but also periods of progress which galvanized the world. The climate diplomacy channel launched in 2013 between China and the United States unleashed global momentum that produced the Paris Agreement. Last year at COP26, the world's hopes were buoyed when the United States and China issued our Glasgow Joint Declaration to work together to address emissions from methane to coal. Climate is not about ideology. It's about math. There's simply no way to solve climate change without China's leadership, the country that produces 28% of global emissions. The International Energy Agency has made clear that if China sticks with its current plan and does not peak its emissions until 2030, then the rest of the world's must go to zero by 2035. and that's simply not possible. Today, about 20 nations are responsible for 80% of emissions. China's number one, the United States is number two. Unless we all do much more, much faster, the financial and human cost will be catastrophic. Plus, competing on clean energy and climate policy can produce results that benefit everyone. The progress that the United States and China make together, including through the working group established by the Glasgow Declaration, is vital to our success in avoiding the worst consequences of this crisis. I urge China to join us in accelerating the pace of these shared efforts. Likewise, on the COVID-19 pandemic, our fates are linked, and our hearts go out to the Chinese people as they deal with this latest wave. We've been through our own deeply painful ordeal with COVID. That's why we're so convinced that all countries need to work together to vaccinate the world, not in exchange for favors or political concessions, but for the simple reason that no country will be safe until all are safe. And all nations must transparently share data and samples and provide access to experts for new variants and emerging and re-emerging pathogens to prevent the next pandemic, even as we fight the current one. On non-proliferation and arms control, it's in all of our interests to uphold the rules, the norms, the treaties that have reduced the spread of weapons of mass destruction. China and the United States must keep working together and with other countries to address Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs. And we remain ready to discuss directly with Beijing our respective responsibilities as nuclear powers. To counter illegal and illicit narcotics, especially synthetic opioids like fentanyl that killed more than 100,000 Americans last year, we want to work with China to stop international drug trafficking organizations from getting precursor chemicals, many of which originate in China. As a global food crisis threatens people worldwide, we look to China, a country that's achieved great things in agriculture, to help with the global response. Last week at the United Nations, the United States convened a meeting of foreign ministers to strengthen global food security. We extended an invitation to China to join. We'll continue to do so. And as the world's economy recovers from the devastation of the pandemic, global macroeconomic coordination between the United States and China is key through the G20, the IMF, other venues, and of course, bilaterally. That comes with the territory of being the world's two largest economies. In short, we'll engage constructively with China wherever we can, not as a favor to us or anyone else, and never in exchange from walking away from our principles, but because working together to solve great challenges is what the world expects from great powers, and because it's directly in our interest. No country should withhold progress on existential transnational issues because of bilateral differences. The scale and the scope of the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China will test American diplomacy like nothing we've seen before. I'm determined to give the State Department and our diplomats the tools that they need to meet this challenge head-on as part of my modernization agenda. This includes building a China House, a department-wide integrated team that will coordinate and implement our policy across issues and regions, working with Congress as needed. And here, I must mention an outstanding team at our embassy in Beijing and our consulates across China, led by Ambassador Nick Burns. They do exceptional work every day, and many have been doing their jobs in recent weeks through these intense COVID lockdowns. Despite extreme conditions, they persisted. We're grateful for this terrific team. I've never been more convinced about the power and the purpose of American diplomacy, or surer about our capacity to meet the challenges of this decisive decade. To the American people, let's recommit to investing in our core strengths, in our people, in our democracy, in our innovative spirit. As President Biden often says, it's never a good bet to bet against America. But let's bet on ourselves and win the competition for the future. To countries around the world committed to building an open, secure, and prosperous future, let's work in common cause to uphold the principles that make our shared progress possible and stand up for the right of every nation to write its own future. And to the people of China, we'll compete with confidence. We'll cooperate wherever we can. We'll contest where we must. We do not seek conflict. There's no reason why our great nations cannot coexist peacefully and share in and contribute to human progress together. That's what everything I've said today boils down to. Advancing human progress, leaving to our children a world that's more peaceful, more prosperous, and more free. Thank you very much for listening.